Hello and welcome to the Penn's Neck History Lecture called Penn's Neck Crossroads-Innovation-Community. If you're watching this, then you're going to be learning about the history of one of West Windsor's historic villages called Penn's Neck. Now, my name is Paul Ligeti, and I'm the president of the Historical Society of West Windsor, and I'm going to talk about them in a bit. But just quickly about Penn's Neck. West Windsor as a township today is obviously a suburban one. This recording is being made in July of 2024, shortly after I gave a lecture at the Princeton Baptist Church on the history of Penn's Neck for people who can come in person. However, historically, West Windsor was not a suburban community for much of its history, for a few centuries at least, and until the late 1900s. West Windsor was actually an agricultural community. Now, unlike Princeton to the west and Hightstown to the east, West Windsor never developed any dedicated downtown area. Instead, a variety of different historic communities popped up within West Windsor over the centuries. You might be familiar with names like Dutch Neck, which is a community at the intersection of South Mill Road and Village Roads East and West, Grover's Mill, which is at the intersection of Clarksville and Cranberry Roads, Edinburgh, at the intersection of Edinburgh Road and Old Trenton Road, Port Mercer, and a number of other communities of Princeton Junction included, which developed in West Windsor over the generations. And Penn's Neck is one of them. Now, Penn's Neck, just for a little bit of context, is located at the intersection, or historically it was centered around the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. Today, it is mainly identified by the neighborhood that is bisected by Washington Road, so west of the Northeast Corridor train tracks. But historically, it was much bigger, as we will explore. So a little bit about the Historical Society before we get into the actual lecture now, is that the Historical Society of West Windsor, we are an all-volunteer nonprofit. We were founded in 1983. And we are, again, a 501c3 nonprofit whose main purpose is to preserve and promote local history. Our main headquarters and where we do most of our operations is the 1700s era West Windsor History Museum. It is at 50 Southfield Road, just a minute north down the road from Grover Middle School and just across the road from the Cranberry Golf Course. We are between Village Road East and Princeton Hightstown Road. We undertake a number of things, even as an all-volunteer nonprofit. We lead museum tours of the property. We publish newspaper articles. We have social media accounts that are very active, such as Facebook and Instagram. We provide scholarships for students. We host a few dozen community events every year, as well as community booths. We publish a West Windsor history book. We do a number of other things, including installing cast metal signs around town, which we have started to do recently, and a lot more. And it takes a lot of work to do all of this. And I give the same general spiel at every video and every lecture, but please consider joining us and donating. Specifically volunteering, because again, we are a very small nonprofit that does do a lot for the community. None of the volunteers are paid to do this, and including making this lecture. We're not paid to do this. We do this because we want to do it, because we care about the history of the community, and because we think it's interesting and it's something that unifies everyone, whether or not your family's lived here for 2 weeks or 200 years. But at the same time, we can't keep doing this unless we get more volunteers. Volunteers are needed to help hold lectures like this one. We need docents for our museum. We need people to help plan events, to help physically restore a property. It's a 1700s era farmstead, so there's a constant need for upkeep. We could use help with fundraising. So if you're interested in helping out with this, and if you want to see lectures like this continue into the future, please consider helping, because again, without community support, we can't necessarily continue doing what we do indefinitely. Now, before I get into the lecture, I do want to mention that, again, we published a West Windsor history book 2 years ago. in celebration of West Windsor's 225th birthday. Now, the book does cover Penn's Neck to a small extent, but this lecture goes into much more detail. That being said, the book has a lot more breadth to it because what Penn's Neck is only one community within West Windsor. In contrast, the book covers the entire history of West Windsor. But again, for each subject, less detail than this lecture will go into Penn's Neck. So one is not a substitution for the other. 100% of the proceeds for this book, which covers the entire township's history from the Ice Age to the present day, will go to the Historical Society. And either you can purchase it online at this link that you see here, westwindsorhistory.com/book, or you can purchase it in person at other events. This last bullet point was only for the purpose of the physical lecture, which we did a few days ago, but the book is going to be for sale at all future events as well. So now we can get started with the actual lecture on Penn's Neck, which, again, I do want to point out, this is the general, this is not encompass the entirety of Penn's Neck, but it's a map of most of the historic sites in Penn's Neck. Some of them still exist, like Pernis Flowers or the Princeton Baptist Church. Others are gone, like the Penn's Neck Community Club or the Dinky Station or the Penn's Neck School. Just a few days ago, someone gave me a good phrase to say for the boundaries of Penn's Neck. It's bounded by water and rail. You can think of the boundaries of Penn's Neck. And again, these are not hard and fast boundaries because some of the sites fall a little bit outside, but as being bounded generally on the south side today by the Dinky Line, on the north by Millstone River, on the west by the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and on the east by the Northeast Corridor. And again, this is not a hard and fast rule because, as you see, the Dinky Station, Hayden Chemical, and Penn's Neck School at the very bottom, near the left side of the screen, those were historically part of Penn's Neck as well, but they don't exist anymore. So as far as existing sites go, it's a pretty good general rule. You can see that Penn's Neck is generally bisected by Washington Road, and then Route 1, which is one of the state's largest transportation corridors nowadays, runs through it as well. And we're going to cover 90% of the sites, or 95% of the sites on this screen. So let's get started. So before we talk about Penn's Neck as a community, I do want to talk a little bit about what existed before here and before European settlement. So Europeans were not the first settlers in the area. Instead, that honor goes to a society known as the Lenni Lenape, who came here about 12,000 years ago, so roughly 10,000 BC. And again, it's a rough estimate. Shortly after the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers retreated, long story short. They lived in a territory called the Lenape-Hoking, which stretched from western Connecticut all the way down to northern Delaware, and also included all of New Jersey and portions of Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland. This territory was not governed by a cohesive society. The Lenape were not a cohesive society. It wasn't like one big tribe. Instead, there were multiple different tribes within the overall society. So the Raritans, who lived by what is now the Raritan River in New Jersey, were a different tribe than the Assunpinks, which were the tribe around the central Jersey area, including where West Windsor is. And you might recognize the name Assunpink because that is a creek. The Assunpink Creek actually flows through southern West Windsor. And when it was dammed in the 1970s, that's when Mercer Lake in Mercer County Park was created. Mercer Lake is actually a portion of the Assunpink Creek that historically was just dammed. Before then, it was just a creek flowing through farmland. And before the farmland, it was a creek flowing through woods. The term Assunpink actually means rocky, watery place in the Algonquin language, which is what the Lenape use. Now, the Lenape ultimately were forced out by colonial pressures by the mid-1700s, if not much earlier. However, there are still artifacts found in the area, especially along waterways like the Millstone River, and including in the Penn's Neck area, which is why I bring them up. The Lenape did generally live in West Windsor as well. Specifically, the Assunpinks lived in West Windsor, including Penn's Neck. But again, over time, they got displaced by colonial pressure. And although some Lenape do still live in New Jersey, a lot of the descendants were forced westward to the Midwest and northward to Canada. But again, some still live in New Jersey. But now we can start talking about the origins of Penn's Neck, which historically was a colonial community that eventually became the neighborhood that it is today. So, and here's a picture of the Millstone River, which again forms the northern border of West Windsor and the northern border of Penn's Neck. The Millstone River was another river that the Lenape used historically for transportation, fishing, and more. Now, in order to talk about Penn's Neck, we should talk about the person after whom it's named, which is William Penn. You probably recognize the name. If not, then his biggest legacy is that was the founder and the namesake of the state of Pennsylvania. He was also a Quaker, which is a sect ultimately of Christianity, although there's obviously a lot more nuance to that. And among other things, Quakerism emphasized a sort of self-teaching and self-reliance of the Bible, which conflicted with the teachings of the Church of England, which at the time was also heavily tied in with the British Crown, meaning that William Penn did not make friends with the British Crown. Instead, he antagonized them or from their perspective, he antagonized them as a result of what he was teaching and as a result of what he advocated for. That being said, he was high up enough in British society that they could not just imprison him indefinitely. So, to make a long story short, they made a deal with him, telling him, "Oh, we're going to grant you however many acres in the New World that eventually became Pennsylvania, and in return, you should bring your followers over there to the New World. New World meaning North America." So that's what he did, and ultimately ended up founding Pennsylvania, which Pennsylvania itself actually means Penn's Woods. That's why it's called Pennsylvania. It's William Penn's Woods. Obviously, it's bigger than a forest. It's an entire state of however million acres, maybe about 40, 45 million off the top of my head, but I could be wrong. But in addition to that, Penn also had significant land holdings in New Jersey. And he also had warm relationships with the Lenape, although his sons famously did not. But that is a story for another day. Now, among his land holdings in New Jersey was about 6,500 acres that he purchased in what eventually became present-day West Windsor. He purchased this in 1693, and you can see the area shaded in yellow, which is called Penn's Neck. It is bordered on the northwest by the Delaware and Raritan Canal, on the northeast by the Millstone River, on the south by the Assunpink Creek, on the southwest by Quaker Bridge Road, which was at the time did not exist and instead was a statewide division line that separated Western Jersey from East Jersey. Back at that time, the state was split into two halves and would not reunite for another 9 years. It was also the chunk of it was you can see that chunk out of West Windsor owned by Thomas Warren and Benjamin Clark that forms the western border with William Penn's territory. And then finally on the eastern line, the big, roughly vertical line where you see Penn-Lyle Road was what was called the Penn-Lyle Division Line in the 1690s. That was called that because William Penn owned the land to the west of that line when he purchased it in 1693. And then 4 years later, when a man named David Lyle purchased about 5,000 acres directly east of William Penn's tract, that line became known as the Penn-Lyle Line. Penn-Lyle Road is called Penn-Lyle Road because it's named after William Penn and David Lyle. And the road itself was built along the Penn-Lyle line in the 1860s. So about 170 years after William Penn purchased the land that would become known as Penn's Neck. Now, the reason it's called Penn's Neck, obviously the word Penn is a reference to William Penn. Neck is I'm sure that you've probably heard of the term neck of the woods. If not, it just generally means a general neighborhood or territory. Now, the word neck itself also historically means neighborhood, territory, tract of land. So, really, Penn's Neck is another way of saying Penn's territory. So, it's pretty descriptive of what it is. So, William Penn owned Penn's Neck, or again, Penn's territory, until he died in 1718, and then his sons possessed it until they sold it to the land's first colonial settlers in 1737. The Penn family never lived in this area, and there's no indication they even ever stepped foot in present-day West Windsor. Instead, all current research points to them being absentee landowners. So, as far as current research tells us, the first colonial settlers came after 1737. Now, that date, that year, 1737, is historically significant because, again, that's when the Penns sold their land to the first settlers, specifically to two men named Garrett Skank and John Covenhoven. Now, the Skank family and the Covenhoven family were ultimately families that came over from the Netherlands to North America in the 1600s. During that time, they settled in an area called New Netherland, which was a Dutch colony that was eventually annexed by the British in the 1660s. And this colony was centered around its capital called New Amsterdam, which you might know as present-day Manhattan. New Netherland was a little bit bigger than that and included Jersey City and a number of other territories of land, but its capital was New Amsterdam, or again, Manhattan. Eventually, over a few generations, the Skank and Covenhoven families worked their way south. Eventually, they settled in Monmouth County. And then in 1737, they made their way over to the land that would become West Windsor with this purchase from William Penn's sons. Now, there's also no significant evidence, as far as we know, that Garrett Skank and John Covenhoven ever lived in the land that became Penn's Neck. However, their children certainly did. And when Garrett Skank and John Covenhoven, shortly after they made that 1737 purchase, they split up the land and deeded it to their children, or deeded much of it to their children. So these children inherited farms that were several hundred acres each rather than 6,500 acres. But even then, these are immense tracts compared to what properties typically are in West Windsor today. Eventually, other families followed the Skanks and Covenhovens. This included names such as the Cruisers, the Stouts, the Heights, Logans, Reeds, Jewels, Maples, and many other families that I'm not going to mention here for brevity, but you can find them in local cemeteries and in documents. And if you want to learn more, please, of course, contact the Historical Society. And in those early days, one of the first things they did was establish immense farms profiting from the fertile land. And again, West Windsor's identity was one of an agricultural community where farmland stretched across virtually almost all of the landscape from the mid 1700s during this first large wave of settlement until the late 1900s when it turned into a suburban township. Now, one thing I should mention is that unfortunately and regrettably, a lot of times some of these families did rely on slave labor. And we are still doing research into the extent of it in Penn's Neck, but we know that members of the Skank and Covenhoven family owned slaves. And we have advertisements for runaway slaves from local newspapers. We have deeds of sale. We have other sources, abandonments, indentures indicating slavery and servitude in the Penn's Neck area. So a lot of this deforestation of the land that turned it into farmland in the first place, and harvesting the land and tilling of it did come from slave labor. A lot of it did come from the farming families themselves too. And typically, historically, a farm that would have had slaves in the 1700s and until the actually, in fact, into the mid 1800s in West Windsor, had about 2 or 3 slaves per farm for those ones that did have them. So it was a fact of life. We're doing more research into that. but I figured I should mention that as well. Now, at the time when Penn's Neck was settled, this West Windsor did not exist. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 1730s. Now, at the time, there was a township that did exist that was much bigger called Windsor Township. Windsor Township, as you can see in this map, included all of West Windsor, all of Robbinsville, and all of East Windsor and Hightstown, and portions of Millstone and Monroe Townships, and all of Princeton, southeast of Nassau Street. Um, Eventually, that West Windsor Township, for a variety of reasons, would split in 1797 into West Windsor and East Windsor. West Windsor being in the northwest, East Windsor being in the southeast. That's why they have their names. Windsor Township originally was named after the royal town of Windsor, England, and it got its name in homage to Windsor, England. Windsor Township itself existed from, it informally was created around 1731. It was formally incorporated in 1751, and then again, it was dissolved in 1797. So in these early years, when settlers came here and they cleared a lot of the forest, built, established a lot of the farmland, built their houses in timber and stone and churches, this was an area called Windsor Township. Now, as I'd mentioned before, West Windsor historically had a number of different separate historic communities separated by farmland. And some of these villages, some of these hamlets got their start during this time period. This includes Penn's Neck as a community, but also included others like Clarksville. At the intersection of Clarksville and Quaker Bridge Road and Route 1 started to be settled as well. Dutch Neck did, Edinburgh, and Grover's Mill as well. These were not huge communities. These are small little hamlets, but they were identifiable, separated by this farmland. Nowadays, now that suburban development has filled in most of that farmland, it's a little bit hard to tell where these villages end and where they begin. And obviously, there's been the loss of many, many historic sites over the past few decades. But there's enough for some of these communities, like in Penn's Neck, like in Dutch Neck, like in Grover's Mill and Edinburgh, that you can identify a number of these communities. So, but getting back to a few generations ago, I just do want to point out that Penn's Neck as a community really did start becoming identified, and as an identifiable territory, did start becoming identifiable by the mid 1700s. The very first reference to Penn's Neck as a territory was 1737. One of the deeds directly after the deed that where the Penn family sold the land to Gary Skank and John Covenhoven. And then here you see a map from 1762 showing Penn's Neck in its context. The river directly to the right of the word Penn's Neck is the Millstone River. This is actually this is not oriented north. This map is more or less oriented northwest. Directly north, or sorry, not north, but directly above the word Penn's Neck, you see the Stony Brook and Princeton. The road running through the middle of Princeton, the yellow road that's horizontal in this map, is Nassau Street and Stockton Street, otherwise known as the King's Highway at the time. So it was an identifiable territory by that time. And in fact, and again, I go back to this, it was an agriculture community at the time as well. And I want to point out a quote from a man named Peter Kalm, who was a Swedish naturalist who visited North America in the late 1740s and early 1750s. And during his travels between New Brunswick and Trenton, he made this quote: "Near almost every farm was a spacious orchard full of peaches and apple trees in such quantities as to cover near the whole ground surface. Part of the fruit is left to rot, since they could not take it all in to consume it. The barns had a peculiar kind of construction, chiefly made use of by the Dutch and Germans. The woods were likewise more cut away, and the country more cultivated, so that one might have imagined himself to be in Europe." And although he wasn't necessarily referring to Penn's Neck specifically, he makes this quote when he's about halfway between Trenton and New Brunswick. So it's definitely roughly in the Penns Neck area, and it very well could have easily described Penns Neck as a bountiful agricultural community where there was so much fertile soil that the crops and the fruits couldn't be used in their entirety. So this landscape in the back that you see here, although admittedly I did generate it through an artificial intelligence, an AI image generator, it could have easily roughly approximated what Penns Neck might have looked like. Flat farmland stretching as far as the eye could see, interrupted only by individual trees or some groves of trees. Now, we can start going into describing some of the actual real sites in Penns Neck. One of the oldest, if not possibly the very oldest confirmed site in town, is called the Skank-Covenhofen Cemetery. Now, obviously, I'm revisiting these family names, the Skank family and the Covenhofen. This was established as a family plot directly on the division line between two of the Skank and Covenhofen farms. For a little bit of context, this cemetery, which again still exists, although it's no longer surrounded by farmland, it's surrounded by Princeton University's campus that they are currently establishing west of Route 1, north of Washington Road, and south of Lower Harrison Street, and east of the Delaware and Raritan Canal. The cemetery is around centered between those four between those four boundaries. Again, Washington Road, Lower Harrison Street, Route 1, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal. Now, this cemetery, it's about 100 feet by 80 feet large, approximately. It's a rough approximation. Is also called the Penns Neck Cemetery in the Old Conover Graveyard, but most commonly today it is called the Skank-Covenhofen Cemetery. Its very oldest grave that we know of dates to 1746, and I mention that because the Historical Society a few years ago did take a survey of the cemetery. We photographed every single gravestone that we could find. We created a map showing the locations of every gravestone. We wrote down all the legible text that we could find on every single one of those stones and associated them with the gravestones. And the oldest one that we could see was from 1746, although it is possible that there are gravestones that are older. It wouldn't make sense for any gravestones to be older than 1737 because that's when, again, the Skank-Covenhofens purchased this territory. So 1746 could very well be the oldest gravestone that was ever established in this graveyard. There's about 80 to 95 graves represented by about 130 stones that still exist today. And the reason that there's a discrepancy between 80 and 95 and 130 is that sometimes graves had more than one stone. For example, you could have an individual who was buried who had both a headstone and a footstone. So that's why there's more stones than there are people. Now, what's also significant about this grave site is not just that it's one of the oldest sites in town, but it also contained a dozen of the township's founders, meaning that out of the 23 men who were the original officers of West Windsor Township's government listed when it formed in 1797, and we know this list because we have the township's original meeting minutes from April 8th, 1797. Out of those 23 men, more than half of them, or a dozen, 12 exactly, are buried in the Skank-Covenhofen Cemetery. There may also be up to 2 additional Revolutionary War soldiers, one man named John R. Skank and another named Nicholas Height. And we're doing research into them. Again, they may or may not be the soldiers, but we suspect that they are. There's other individuals, of course. There are, mothers and sisters, there's preachers, there's teachers, and there's a number of other individuals. And a number of these were some of the original settlers, the colonial settlers, of the area. Now, here are some pictures of the gravestones. Here's 4 pictures of the gravestones in the Skank-Covenhofen Cemetery. You can see David Height on the lower left, deceased January 1780. You can see that it's hand carved. In contrast, the next one, the second from the left, in memory of Nicholas Height, who departed this life September 15th, 1805, in the 78th year of his age. You can see his gravestone is a little bit more professionally carved. The third one from the left, or the second one from the right, is the oldest gravestone that we know of in the cemetery and, in fact, in West Windsor. This is the one from 1746. You see it says M, and then we believe that the second letter is I with a crossbar, and then 1746 is written below it. We don't know who this is for. We don't even know what the last initial of I would be. So we're still trying to figure that one out. And then the fourth one, or the rightmost one, is in memory of Phoebe, wife of Harmon Covenhoven, who died February 2nd, 1832, aged 87 years, 9 months, and 16 days. And Phoebe and Harmon were some of the original, if not the children, at least the grandchildren of Garrett Skank, or one of them was the grandchild of either of John Covenhoven, who purchased the land in 1737. So, another drone shot of the cemetery from a few years back. So the cemetery was most active from the mid 1700s to the late 1800s. By the time that a wall was installed around the cemetery in the 1870s, specifically 1876, the burials started to slow down, and they really did slow down after the 1890s. The last burial in 1941, I believe, was for a woman named Sarah Eleanor Martin, and there have not been any in the 83 years since, and I suspect that there will never again be any. And from the 1870s until the late 1960s, there was an organization called the Penn's Neck Cemetery Association who cared for the cemetery. And in fact, I believe they were also the ones who installed the wall. However, they dissolved in 1969, or approximately 1969. And as a result, no one legally inherited the cemetery. The Cemetery Association did not formally deed or sell it to anyone, or even bequeath it, meaning that legally no one owns the cemetery. Princeton University does own all of the land around it, but the cemetery itself, anything inside the wall, is legally, no one owns it. It's an orphan. So meaning that for a few decades in the late 1900s, the Historical Society of Princeton effectively acted as its caretaker. But I believe it was in the early 1990s that the responsibility was passed to the Princeton Baptist Church, who still cares for it to this day. And I do know that they paid for restoration of a portion of the wall that had collapsed, and it was repaired a number of months ago. So I was happy to see that. Today, the cemetery, if we go back to this image, it's more or less in the same condition. The farmland around it is gone, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, a little closer to the end of the lecture. But there's only a few small weeds at this point growing up in the cemetery, so it's in a lot better condition than it used to be. And I hope that it remains in good condition the years going forward, because it is, again, one of West Windsor's most historic sites. So another thing that we should talk about is the Penn's Neck Schoolhouse, another one of West Windsor's original buildings. Now, the original Penn's Neck Schoolhouse does not exist anymore, but according to legend, according to a source called Old Princeton's Neighbors, and in fact, there might be an even older source that refers to it. It was built prior to 1760 in Penn's Neck and was supposedly West Windsor's oldest and original school. According to the sources, that school, that one built prior to 1760, was timber framed. It was a one-room schoolhouse that was built by parents of the community. Now, these parents, at this time, there was no public education in West Windsor. Instead, parents are said to have paid a teacher, or generally paid teachers, to come and teach their kids in what was effectively a form of private education. Over the years, the school was moved. It should actually say it was moved twice, not three times. The school was moved twice. Once it was moved in the mid-1800s, further south along Route 1. And then a second time it was moved again in the also in the mid 1800s, I believe the 1860s or 70s, to where we suspect its current location is. Now, originally, the original Penn's Neck School location, again, the one prior to 1760, was off of the corner of a road called Eden Way, or its older name is Logan Drive, which is just off of Lower Harrison Street and Route 1. You can see it in some maps of West Windsor, including old maps. Later on, it was moved to, I believe it was between Alexander Road and the Dinky Line tracks, or the Princeton Branch Railroad. And then the third time I'm gonna show in the next picture. In 1917, the schoolhouse formally shut down and was converted into a house. The reason it was shut down is because also in 1917, the Dutch Neck School, the brick and stone Dutch Neck School that's on Village Road East, which still operates to this day as an elementary school, was constructed. And also, Dutch Neck School had an identical twin, also built in 1917, called the Penn's Neck School, which was also again, it was an identical twin. It was also a brick and stone school that made the schoolhouse obsolete. The old wooden schoolhouses were becoming obsolete due to the construction of these two larger and larger capacity and better equipped brick and stone schools. Now, the reason these schools were built is, and its broader context is that in the early 1900s, there was a movement, a nationwide movement called the Progressive Movement. I believe Teddy Roosevelt was one of its most prominent advocates. And among other things, it emphasized increased focus on standardization and funding for education, which is why old schoolhouses, wooden schoolhouses across the nation became increasingly obsolete as communities built, like West Windsor did, updated facilities, typically brick and mortar and brick and stone, like what West Windsor did with the Dutch Neck School and the Penn's Neck School. And we're going to talk about the Penn's Neck School later on in this lecture. So, beginning to the schoolhouse itself, which again is not the same thing as the Penn's Neck School, we believe that this building, which is located at 3667 Brunswick Pike, 3667 Brunswick Pike, may have been the old Penn's Neck School. You notice the old stone foundation. It is definitely an older building. Now, this is located directly to the northeast side of Route 1, meaning that if you're heading southbound on Route 1, you're going to see it on your right, just across the road from the large Carnegie Center commercial complex. Again, in 1917, the school was converted into a house after it shut down, and then it had functioned as a house for many years. And now we're not quite sure what it's used for, but we believe it might be offices or some kind of storage location. But it's actually in much better condition than it was just a few years ago. I believe they either replaced the old siding or repainted it. So it's nice to see that it's kept up and wasn't torn down, or at least not yet. And we hope it stands, going on into the future. Now, another another building, and another one that doesn't exist anymore, like the old Penn's Neck, the original Penn's Neck School, is I want to point out this house, the Covenhoven Jewel Farmstead. This was one of Penn's Neck's original houses, and it probably dated to the mid 1700s. It originally was part of a property owned by the Covenhoven family, specifically a man named William Covenhoven. And the Covenhovens owned it from the mid 1700s up until the 1840s when they passed to the Jewell family, which is another old local family. The Jewells owned it for many years. Eventually, it was sold to the Princeton University in 1948, who rented it out to various tenants. And I highlight the Keel family here in honor of, I know one of the followers of our Facebook page is a member of the Keel family. So if he's watching this, he'll probably appreciate mention of this. This house was located a few hundred feet directly north of the intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road. So it was northeast of Washington Road by a few hundred feet, northwest of Route 1 by a few hundred feet. Unfortunately, it was demolished about 20 to 25 years ago, but we still have this photograph of the house from 1939. This photograph was taken in 1939. And you can see it was a larger house compared to what a lot of colonial houses were, which indicated that the families had some level of wealth. Another building that I want to point out, although this one does still exist, is called the Red Lion Inn. Now, it does not exist as an inn anymore. It's not an inn anymore, but it does. The building still exists, although it has a different purpose now. This building was located directly at the intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road. It was built in 1807, or roughly 1807, by a man named William Covenhoven, which is a different William Covenhoven, I believe, than the one who owned the Covenhoven Jewel farmhouse. Now, uh, uh, for a little bit of context, in 1804, that's when Route 1 was chartered. It was chartered as the Trenton New Brunswick Turnpike because it connected the cities of Trenton and New Brunswick. Around the same time, Washington Road, which was actually a much older private farm lane, was formally surveyed as a public road connecting Princeton to the area, to the West Windsor area. What resulted was that Penn's Neck as a community started clustering around this intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road. One of its earliest buildings was after the clustering. One of the earliest buildings that was part of this clustering was the Red Lion Inn. And again, all the Penn's Neck as a community did exist well before this clustering happened, as we discussed. As a community, it was as old as the 1730s. However, it was much more spread out until the very early 1800s when the two roads, Route 1 and Washington Road, were surveyed, and then it started becoming more of a crossroads community rather than a spread out farming community. So the Red Lion Inn was constructed directly at this intersection. It was directly at the western corner of this intersection, so southeast of Route 1 and northwest of Washington Road. It was directly at that crossroads, and this was long, long, long before there was a traffic circle. Instead, it was just a simple four-way intersection that was much narrower than the traffic circle that we have today. So William Covenhoven constructed this building in 1807, but he was not the tavern owner as far as we know. Instead, the first tavern owner was a man named John Jolie, and he was the first of many, many tavern owners over the generations. Now, the very next year, Township Committee started meeting here. West Windsor Township Committee started meeting in this tavern. Previously, they had met at a tavern in Dutch Neck, the community of Dutch Neck, which again is at the intersection of South Mill Road and Village Road to East and West. This tavern was called historically Wittlebergen's Tavern, and we have another video on our YouTube page about Wittlebergen's Tavern if you want to search it. So feel free to look at that. We also have Wittlebergen's Tavern on our website. Its history from its approximate creation in the late 1700s until the present day. So we have that information as well. And if you can't find it, feel free to contact us. Our information, either A, you can come to the museum and talk to us, or B, if you want to email us, our email is westwindsorhistory@gmail.com in 2024. So again, westwindsorhistory@gmail.com, and our website is westwindsorhistory.com. So Township Committee met here occasionally starting in 1808. They did not always meet here. This was one site of many that Township Committee met in long before there was an official municipal center. And for some time, this building was also called the White Horse Tavern when it was under ownership of a man named Asher Temple, who also promoted a lot of horse racing in the area. So the Red Lion Inn, here's a photo of it from, we believe, prior to 1694, and we're suspecting prior to 1894, of course not 1694. And we suspect that this photograph is from the mid to late 1800s. This is looking at the backside of the Red Lion Inn, and the photographer is standing in the lawn approximately a dozen feet away or so from Washington Road, and they're facing Route 1. The Red Lion Inn is the building in the very center of the photograph, the building that's closer, and across the road is a rival tavern called Giberson's Tavern, which we're going to talk about very briefly in a little bit. You can see that there's a tavern rates in this image from 1807. In case you can't read it, I'll just read off a few of the items. a good breakfast, which is literally called a good breakfast, it costs 36 cents. Lodging is 10 cents. A gin is 10 cents as well. A toddy, which I have no clue what that is, doesn't actually seem to have a price. Cider Royal is 25 cents. You can get a good, well, again, that's interesting. A good breakfast is 36 cents, but a common breakfast is 25 cents. It seems like a good breakfast must have, of course, had more. So these were the tavern rates, and this is a photocopy of some tavern rates for me, set by the county of Middlesex. And at the time, West Windsor was part of Middlesex County because Mercer County did not form until 1838. And that year, 1838, is when West Windsor became part of Mercer County. So again, the oldest image that we have of Red Lion Inn is this one. And this was long before it moved a few dozen feet south to its current location. Now, this is the Red Lion Inn today. In 1879, the Red Lion Inn, which again had been functioning as an inn for a little bit over 70 years, was turned into a parsonage for the Princeton Baptist Church. A parsonage is another name, in this case, for a house and office for the pastor of the Princeton Baptist Church, which is directly next door and which we're going to talk about next. 50 years later, so in 1929, the Red Lion Inn was relocated a few dozen feet south to its current location at 261 Washington Road. This was because Route 1 was being widened at the time. Now, again, the Red Lion Inn, this is photographing the front of the Red Lion Inn a few years ago. And I was the one who took this photograph, and I was standing on Washington Road, just a few dozen feet away from the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. And in 1989, the property, including the Red Lion Inn and the church, were listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then more recently, in 2022, it was dedicated as Haven House, which originally was intended to function as housing for single mothers, but now functions as housing in another capacity. So it's still being used to this day, although, of course, not as an inn anymore. Now, I mentioned the Princeton Baptist Church a number of times. This is a photograph of that church in the very early 1900s. I believe this photograph was taken in 1908. If I'm not exactly right about the year, then I'm within a few years. Now, this is one of West Windsor's most historic sites. This is also located at 261 Washington Road. In case you're wondering which church it is, I'm going to fast forward a few slides. It is this one. This is the church that directly faces Washington Road, a few hundred feet north of the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. It's on the west side or the northbound side of Route 1, and again is north of Washington Road. And it is West Windsor's oldest house of worship. Now, the congregation for the Princeton Baptist Church began in the year 1790 under a pastor named Peter Wilson. Originally, the congregation met in houses in the area. This includes houses in present-day Lawrence Township. And eventually, the congregants started meeting out in houses in the Penns Neck community. But eventually, after 22 years of doing this, they decided that they wanted a formal house of worship. So in 1812, after William Covenhoven, who also donated the land that became the Red Lion Inn, donated a parcel of land for the express purpose of building a church, which they did. Now, originally, this church, which I must emphasize, it currently faces Route 1. This church originally was actually parallel to Route 1. So it was rotated 90 degrees originally, but it was rotated to its current configuration later, and we're going to discuss that. So the church was built in 1812. Within the next few years, the cemetery behind the church, which currently contains, I think it's about 650 gravestones, maybe 550, but I think it's 650. That cemetery or graveyard was established soon after the church was built. Now, originally, this church was called the Williamsboro Baptist Church or Williamsburg Baptist Church. And I want to point that name out because very few people recognize the name Williamsburg as it exists today in terms of its reference to Penn's Neck as a community. However, Williamsburg was a term for this community as well. A William is a reference to William Penn. And Burg is just meaning, Williams, Williamsboro, Williamstown, Williams Village. So this was Williams Village Baptist Church originally. Now, Williamsburg, we don't know when that term started being used. The earliest reference to it is in 1812 in the original church minutes, the earliest reference that we know of. And by the 1830s, 1840s, it pretty much died out as a term. So the term Penn's Neck, in reference to the community, which again was much, much, much older, the earliest references from 1737, the term Penn's Neck was also the term that's currently being used. So it's interesting to see that there was this somewhat of a few decades of using the term Williamsboro, but Penn's Neck, which was the original term, as far as we know, is also the current term as well. So it's held pretty well. Now, the church, of course, was the center of spiritual and social life. And Penn's Neck is not unique in this aspect, but I should point it out that in many of many of West Windsor's and Central Jersey, and in fact, many of the United States' early communities, churches were a huge part of their social and spiritual life. They were the centers around which people met and greeted their neighbors, caught up on things, talked, and then, of course, worshipped God according to their religion. So now, the Princeton Baptist Church, however, was not always a huge congregation. There were many, many times when it was small, when there were conflicts. It fluctuated back and forth in terms of how much population there was within the congregation. And there was also a conflict in terms of where exactly they worshipped. And this gives rise to, this is why it's called the Princeton Baptist Church today, because again, remember, it was originally called the Williamsburg or Williamsboro Baptist Church. Now, in 1852, this church decided that it wanted to move to Princeton on Alexander Street and be renamed the Princeton Baptist Church. And many of the congregants did so. And the reason they moved to Princeton was probably because they had a larger population there to worship to, and probably because it had more of a panache than the countryside of West Windsor did. Now, however, there were a number of Penn's Neck residents who did not want to move to Princeton, or did not want the church to move to Princeton, and they actually stayed behind and kept their own church, which existed from 1853 until, I believe, 1859, and it was called the West Windsor Particular Baptist Church. Now, again, that church only lasted approximately 6 years and dissolved, but there were members of the Penn's Neck community who still brought pastors occasionally to Penn's Neck to preach. Now, for one reason or another, in 1874, the Princeton Baptist Church, which had about, again, 22 years of success in the Princeton area, decided that they wanted to move back to Penn's Neck and reunite with their brethren who had stayed in the Penn's Neck area. So that's what happened. Under I believe this is his name, Reverend Grinnell, the congregation moved back to Penn's Neck. They took the church building, which again was still standing, but it was leaking. It was in poor shape, and it was too small for their needs. It was drafty. So what they decided to do is they renovated the sanctuary. They enlarged it. I believe they actually added the vestibule that is in the back of the church. So you cannot see it in this photograph, but it's on the very opposite side of the church from where this photographer is standing. And they also rotated it 90 degrees in the 1870s. Also in the 1870s, as I mentioned, they purchased the Red Lion Inn and turned it into a parsonage. And then in 1929, they moved the Red Lion Inn to its current location. In 1963, they built a cinder block building, which still exists on the church property, and they called it the Christian Education Building. It's a general purpose building, but the old white church building is still, of course, used for their main worship. As I mentioned before, in 1989, the church was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the Princeton Baptist Church does still worship there as a small congregation, but they also rent out the property to other congregations as well. Now, Penn's Neck, of course, was not just the Red Lion Inn and the Princeton Baptist Church. There were a number of other establishments in the area. Of course, there were various properties owned by the local farmers, and you can see in this picture, which I'm going to get to in the next slide, that there were a number of houses in the area, a number of landowners, different farms lived in by different families. However, in addition to that, because Penn's Neck really was a crossroads community, there were a number of other establishments as well. There was a general store in the area. There was a blacksmith, a wheelwright shop, a harness shop, a wagon repair shop, and about a dozen residences. As I'd mentioned a few slides back when talking about the Red Lion Inn, there was a rival tavern to the Red Lion Inn for a few, I think it's a few decades, and if not, maybe at least several years in the mid-1800s, called Giberson's Tavern, which is pictured here. It was directly across the road from the Red Lion Inn, so this would have been directly at the northern corner of the intersection of Route 1, which runs from southwest to northeast, and Washington Road, which runs from northwest to southeast. And of course, there was endless farmland stretching as far as the eye could see for the most part. So here's another image. I go back to this image of Penn's Neck. This is in close-up of a map from 1875 of West Windsor. You can note at the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1, you see basically in the center of this photograph, you see Noah Reed's Hotel, which has about 2 acres. That is the Red Lion Inn. You see the Baptist Church and the cemetery right behind it, just a little bit to the northeast of Noah Reed's Hotel. Directly across the road, you see that circle with the cross in it. That is the blacksmith shop. You see the house with 139 acres owned by Thomas Jewell, with a farm lane curving up to it. That was the Covenhoven Jewell farmstead that we had explored several slides back. And you see the dashed line going from the left side of this image to the bottom center of this image. That is the Dinky line, which we're going to discuss in the next slide. The Dinky line is also a railroad that connects the Princeton Junction train station in West Windsor into the community of Princeton, our municipal neighbor to the northwest. Now, there's a number of transportation systems which also helped grow Penn's Neck. In 1834, the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which is the northwest boundary of West Windsor, it's its boundary with Princeton Township. In 1834, the Delaware and Raritan Canal was opened as a transportation corridor between, I believe it is roughly the Trenton Bordentown area in the southwest of West Windsor, all the way up to the general New Brunswick area. It's meant to connect the Delaware and Raritan rivers. Now, 5 years later, the Camden and Amber Railroad established a railroad line directly on the eastern bank of the canal, or in West Windsor. And for many decades, these transportation systems worked hand in hand. And they were, they did transport people, of course, but for the most part, they were commercial corridors. However, in 1863, the Camden and Amber Railroad decided that it wanted to straighten its line because following the course of the canal meant that trains could not travel that fast. They had to navigate some turns. So instead, what they did is they straightened the line, and that became what is now known as the present Northeast Corridor, which was established in 1863. Now, shortly thereafter, or within the same year, if not a year later, the Princeton Junction the Princeton Junction train station opens, and then in 1865, the Dinky line, otherwise known as the Princeton Branch Railroad, was open to the public. And this is a line, I believe it is about maybe 1.5 miles long, or maybe a little bit over a mile. It's a very short railroad. So if I'm not getting the exact length right, then I'm up close enough. It's one of the shortest railroads in the nation, and it connects again the Princeton Junction train station to Princeton Township. Now, the Dinky line did have a number of stops, one in Princeton Junction, of course, a few in Princeton, and then there was one in Penn's Neck. It was located directly east of Route 1. And there is, even today, there is the Dinky line still runs, and there is a metal railroad bridge that it runs over Route 1. And that is where this stop that you can see pictured here was. It was on the east side of Route 1, or the northbound side. Now, another thing I should point out is that for many years, there was a recreational area called the Sheep Wash. Now, we're talking about a period of time long before there were formal parks in West Windsor. This is a bend in the Millstone River. It's essentially a watering hole. It's a bend in the Millstone River that is behind the David Sarnoff property. So on the eastern end of the Penn's Neck area. And it was called the Sheep Wash because long ago, this was originally where local farmers would actually take their sheep to wash them. It's a pretty self-explanatory name. Now, by the early 1900s, however, it also became a swimming hole for the local community, and you can see some neighbors having fun here. This was the place to be for young Penn's Neck kids. There would be baseball games in the area, picnics. There are still some remnants of a rope swing there and some bridges. And it hasn't been used in a number of decades, not since the mid 20th century. But even today, there are a number of Penn's Neck locals who are longtime locals who remember having fond memories in that area as kids. Now, again, this hasn't been used in a while, but it's still part of the memories of Penn's Neck. Now, another property I should point out is the Anglekay Farm. This was located on the east side, or again, the northbound side of Route 1, just south of the Millstone River. It was a property purchased by a man named Henry Anglekay in 1859, and it remained in the Anglekay hands well into the 20th century, but now it's the site of what is now known as the SRI International property. It's a research and development complex. Prior to that, it was known as the David Sarnoff Research Center, which is why I have the word Sarnoff on this slide. And before that, it was known as RCA Laboratories. And even before that, it was known as the Anglekay Farm. But again, the farm does not exist anymore, although I am told that some of the original apple trees from the Anglekay Farm are still on the main drive into the SRI International property. So that was quite interesting to hear a few days ago at the lecture. Now, the reason I point this out is because the Historical Society used to publish a newsletter called Broadside. We still do publish a newsletter, but it's not called Broadside anymore. But in Broadside, in the 1980s, a member of the Anglekay family talked about the history of the Anglekay farm. And I want to point out this quote. It's thematically similar to the quote that I read earlier about Peter Kalb and his travels in North America in the 1740s and 50s, in the sense that this quote talks a little bit about the agricultural dominance of the area. So I'll just read it off. Henry, otherwise known as Henry Anglekay, planted many fruit trees and berry bushes. The apples were fine old strains, Northern Spies, Bellflowers, Greenings, Smith Ciders, Fall Pippins, and Rustics. There were crab apples too, and pears, Seckel, Bartlett, Pound, as well as peach trees, a prune plum, a pawpaw, and a rare orange quince. There were white cherries, ox hearts, and pie cherries. Gooseberries, blackberries, currants, and strawberries were there too. Near their house he planted straight shade trees, a linden, an ash, and arbor vitae. In front of the dwelling were two large maples, from one of which every summer hung festoons of the reddish-orange flowers of a Virginia creeper. And again, I'm pointing this out for the purpose of demonstrating that West Windsor really was, and Penn's Neck too, really was a farming community, and its current suburban identity is only a recent thing. It only really started taking off in the 1980s and 1990s. So back then, we're talking 1920s, even up to the mid 1900s, but certainly before then, Penn's Neck really was a farming community, and so was West Windsor. However, in the 1920s, some of this started changing. So Penn's Neck started to suburbanize to some extent starting in the 1920s. Specifically, there were two developments. One of them was called Varsity View, and the other one called Princeton Manor, which changed this dynamic. In 1926, a man named Julius C. Wildermuth presented plans for the Varsity View community, featuring 42 lots that were specifically designated as residential, although they didn't end up being. And you can see the advertisement here. And in 1927, Fred Walters presented plans for Princeton Manors with 150 lots. And I'm going to show a map of those two lots within 2 slides from this one. So I'll just read off the Varsity View advertisement from, I believe this is from 1926. If not exactly 1926, it's within a year or two. So it says, build a home at Varsity View, Princeton's most convenient suburb, located at Penn's Neck, New Jersey, near the Pennsylvania Railroad Station. Beautiful building sites. Exceptional advantages include excellent water, electricity, gas, and sidewalks. It's near a fine public school, Trenton and Princeton bus service. All building sites restricted for residential purposes only. For further particulars, see J.C. Wildermuth or Julius C. Wildermuth in Penn's Neck, New Jersey. So again, I do want to emphasize Penn's Neck really was a farming community, but you start to see the community grow around the intersection of Washington Road, which is the main road going directly from the northwest to the southeast, and Route 1, which is the thickest road going from the southwest to the northeast. And the words Penn's Neck are directly smack dab in the middle of the intersection of Washington Road and Route 1. And you can maybe start to see these houses start to pop up. If you can look closely enough, you'll see the houses start to pop up and start to cluster around this intersection as Penn's Neck as a community starts to grow as a suburban community. Now, today, of course, Penn's Neck really is a suburban community for the most part. And you can see that in this slide. But here, I just want to highlight the extent of the original Varsity View in Princeton Manor. You can see Varsity View originally, again, had 142 lots. It's bounded to the south by Mather Avenue, and I want to emphasize that that is the correct way to pronounce it. It's not Mather, it's Mather. And it's called Mather Avenue because the Mather family were farmers who owned land in that area. It's bounded to the west by Route 1, to the north by Washington Road, and to the east by Wilder Avenue. And again, this is named after Julius C. Wildermuth. It's named after him, or his family at least. And then Varsity Avenue, the term varsity is probably a reference to Princeton University because obviously they want to advertise their proximity to Princeton University and the panache of Princeton as a township. And then you see Princeton Manor, which I want to emphasize the extent of Princeton Manor. This represents the original planned extent. Of course, not all of it was built, but this was the original plan for Princeton Manor. It included roads such as Fairview Avenue, Morning Sun Avenue, Manor Avenue, and Brookside Avenue. Now, the roads that are dashes were never built, but they were planned. You can see that it's bounded to the east by Little Bear Brook, to the south by Washington Road, to the west by a property line, and to the north by a road that never ended up being built, but it originally was planned. It was called Hibben Road. And again, this development, Princeton Manor, was originally planned to have about 150 homes. And we're going to talk about some of the homes, some of the businesses and establishments and institutions that got their start in the Varsity View and Princeton Manor in the coming slides. Now, again, Princeton Manor and Varsity View. Some of the buyers who purchased properties in Princeton Manor and Varsity View, some of them were sold with homes that were already built. So some buyers bought houses that were already built on the lots. But there were a lot of buyers who, just like a different community in West Windsor called Berrien City, in Princeton Manor Varsity, a lot of buyers bought empty lots and constructed their own homes. And a lot of times these homes were constructed from kits, like those provided by Sears Roebuck, for example. And over the next few years, and especially the next few decades, a tight-knit community started to grow, a neighborhood in this area, where neighbor knew neighbor, and children grew up together, and families really knew each other. It was the stereotypical community where you could walk over to your neighbor's house and ask for a cup of sugar, that kind of stereotype. Now, of course, the community has grown significantly over the decades, and Penns Neck has grown significantly over the decades in general. You can see how many houses are in the general Penns Neck area. This must be several hundred at least. But in those early days, in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there were fewer homes, but of course it has since suburbanized. But although some of the original families who moved to Princeton Manor and Varsity View when they were established, some of them do still live in the area. Now, one of the original community institutions was a building called the Penns Neck, or really an organization called the Penns Neck Community Club. They were founded in 1922 and built a clubhouse in 1924. So if we go back to the two slides back, on the very left side of the page, where you see Varsity View, directly on its western boundary, where you see Route 1, actually in the very southwest or the lower left corner of the boundary of Varsity View, that's where the Penns Neck Community Club was. It was torn down around the year 2017. However, it was built in 1922 and really was a kind of a community center of sorts. In its early years, they hosted what were called strawberry festivals, which it's an agricultural festival. They had community fairs, card parties. It should be not comedy shows, it's just the comedy shows and dances and more. And this operated as a community center of sorts until the 1960s, when it became a scientific device manufacturing business called Techni, or it became owned by that company. And then, but eventually Techni stopped operating it. The community club was abandoned long ago, and sadly, it was demolished in 2017. And here's a picture of the community club during its own early years, including some of its early members. Now, I had mentioned before about Penns Neck School, which again was an identical twin to Dutch Neck, and it was built just like Dutch Neck in the year 1917 to replace West Windsor's old wooden schoolhouses. This schoolhouse was, the Penns Neck School, the one built in 1917, was located at the intersection of Alexander Road and Route 1. Specifically, it was on the northern corner. So it was northwest of Route 1 and northeast of northeast of Alexander Road. And this was back at the time when it was built. Alexander Road and Route 1 were at the same grade. It was an at-grade four-way intersection. Alexander did not get an overpass over Route 1 until the 1990s. Now, the first principal of Penns Neck School was a man named Roy P. Stillwell. However, he only served for a year or two. The longest serving principal, and by far the most memorable, and one of the most memorable residents of Penns Neck in general, was a woman named Georgiana Hawk, who served from the early 1920s until the year 1964. A number of Penns Neck residents and a number of people who might be watching this video shortly after I publish it might very well remember Georgiana Hawk as their principal. She served as the principal for a few generations of Penns Neck residents. And she was not a strict buffet, but she was a popular enough principal and obviously long-serving enough that when she retired in 1964, it is said that over 900 people, or approximately 900 people, attended her retirement party. So she must have been quite a memorable figure in the Penns Neck community. Now, Georgiana Hawk, you can see her in the very rear of this photograph. She's the woman in the very back of all the students. Again, she retired in 1967, and I believe this photograph was taken in the 1950s or 1960s. Now, she retired in 1964. Sorry, if I said 1967, I mean 1964. She retired in 1964, but the school operated for 3 more years, but eventually it became obsolete more or less because of the construction of Morris Hawk School, which still operates off of Clarksville Road, just a short distance away from High School South. So Penn's Neck School formally closed in 1967 as a school, and over the next few decades, it housed a variety of different institutions, including an adult autism service called the Eden Institute, a planning group, architects, and an employment agency. The Penn's Neck School was demolished in 1995 in order to make way for the Alexander Road overpass over Route 1, which again still exists to this day. And I want to remind everyone that I am recording this in July of 2024. You can see the date on the lower left. Now, let's go to the next slide. Another institution that developed in the 1920s. Again, Penn's Neck School was the 1910s. Princeton Manor University used the 1920s. Now we also have another one for the 1920s. It was called the Washington Road Elm Alley. This was an elm corridor that was planted as a gateway between West Windsor and Princeton, in the early to mid 1920s. And it was planted for two reasons. Number one, to serve kind of as a gateway between the communities of Penn's Neck and Princeton. But also, it was part of a larger nationwide movement at the time that emphasized the beautification of public areas. And among this broader movement was a sub-movement to plant trees along larger used public roads. So this is kind of how this came to be. The trees that were originally planted, I believe there were about 136 trees, were a cultivar called Princeton elm, which was developed by William Flemmer II, who operated who was an employee and one of the main figures of a institution called Princeton Nurseries, which operated for many years in the area. Now, this cultivar, Princeton elm, was a derivation of a different cultivar called the American elm, which is typically found on a lot of older college campuses and university campuses, such as Princeton University. The elm is representative and symbolic of stateliness and heritage and a general idea of the institutions that colleges profess to uphold. One thing that's notable about the Princeton elm cultivar, is that it's especially resistant to a disease called Dutch elm disease, which has wiped out many trees over many decades and is decimated, well, not even decimated, it's annihilated some subspecies of trees, but the ones along Washington Road have proven especially hardy, which is notable. And that being said, only about half of the trees, if maybe less than half of the trees, still exist anymore. But part of that might also be due to the stresses of traffic traveling along Washington Road. So the trees were added to the National Register of Historic Places in the year 1999. And it's one of four sites in West Windsor that are on the National Register at the time of this recording. The other three sites being the Princeton Baptist Church, the Red Lion Inn, as we discussed, and another building called the John Rogers House, which is not in Penn's Neck, and it's in a completely other location in West Windsor called, which is now Mercer County Park. Now, so meaning that means that three sites of the four that are on the National Register in West Windsor are in Penn's Neck. Again, the Washington Road Elm Alley, the Princeton Baptist Church, and the Red Lion Inn. And to this day, despite the changes and the loss of trees to the Washington Road Elm Alley, it still stands as a pretty good example of early 20th century attempts to beautify the American landscape. Here's another institution which you might recognize. This is looking at the building from Washington Road. I believe the exact address is, there we go, it's 92 Washington Road. Nowadays it's an indoor tennis courts. It's this metal building directly to the northeast of Little Bear Brook, where Washington Road crosses over the Little Bear Brook. However, much earlier, this was originally an outdoor swimming pool long before this building existed. Now, this swimming pool was called the Princeton Swimming Pool, and it was opened in the year 1932 by a company called Princeton Natatorium Incorporated. It was a popular pool which hosted swim meets, parties, competitions, and a lot more. One thing that's notable about it is that in the year 1944, it was managed by a man named Mike Bloom, who eventually, just a few years later, actually played for the Boston Celtics basketball team. Um, and I believe they still exist. And he also patented a version of a plumber snake. The next decade in the 1950s, I think the exact year was 1959, it was temporarily shut down after a discrimination complaint by an African American resident named Ulysses Johnson, who was denied entry. So there was some racial discrimination, of course, in the pool. And this is we only know about this because there's a newspaper article, but there very well could have been a lot more racial discrimination as far as we know. Um, so research is ongoing into that. In the 1960s, it was operated by a man named Aristotle Phrasiles, who we believe, as far as I remember, a longtime Pensneck resident telling me was of Greek origin. And then in the next decade, 1970, it was purchased by Tennis International, who turned it into indoor courts in 1973. So that's when this was established as the Princeton Tennis Courts. Either way, it is a long-time institution which operated from the 1930s to the 1970s as a pool. And even to this day, some Pensneck residents and former Pensneck residents still probably remember it pretty well. Although, of course, there were some issues like the discrimination, issues that were significant to some of the residents of Pensneck. Another institution which opened in the 1930s was the Bear Brook Tavern. This building is located at 95 Bear Brook Road. It was opened as a tavern around the year 1933 by a man named Steve Anderson. And it was just a general restaurant slash tavern. It hosted weekly Saturday night dances, and there was a banquet room on the second floor. I just want to point it out because today people might not otherwise know that this actually had a number of other uses beyond its current one. And in 1967, it was turned into the American Legion Post 76 headquarters. However, 23 years ago, so in the year 2001, it was bought by the Princeton Korean Community Church, which still uses it as their church. It's one of roughly a dozen, I think there's a little bit more than a dozen at this point, houses of worship and religious institutions in West Windsor. And this is one of the ones in Pensneck. But again, I just want to point it out because if you were to pass by this and see Korean Community Church, you probably, most people would probably not know this actually used to be a tavern. Another institution, which still exists as a building, was Jerry's Market. And I just want to go to the next slides quickly to show you the image of what it looks like today. Today, it's a Papa John's at 175 Washington Road. However, it was originally built in the 1930s as a sort of grocery store and butcher shop. It was built in 1936 by a man named Joseph Jerob. And shortly before he built this, he had been petitioning for the right to build a slaughterhouse on or close to that property, but his request was denied after a lot of public uproar. So instead, what he did is he built this building, which was again this grocery market and butcher shop, which sold meat, vegetables, and canned goods. Joseph and his wife Jenny imposed a strong work ethic on their kids, and or maybe his wife was named Jane. I remember her name starts with a J, and I can look it up later. They imposed a strong work ethic on their kids, and the shop was said to have operated for 7 days a week from the early morning until 11 p.m. Eventually, the shop was sold to the Salkins, who also sold cosmetics, toys, stationery, and more. Later, it passed to someone named Izzy Strasvogel. It was known as Izzy's, which a lot of people watching this video shortly after I publish it might very well remember. And then it became a number of other institutions as well. It should say family. Ann's Family Deli. After that was Mrs. Pasta and Deli, and then Domain Catering and Delicatessen. And then by the late 1990s, it became the Papa John's, a pizza restaurant, which again it is today. But the building still stands, and you can see that obviously the facade has had a number of changes. There's been an addition made onto it. However, as a general form, you can see what the original portion of the building that it still stands. Here's another institution known as Pernis Flowers. This was established, this is located, I believe, at 189 Washington Road, so just a few properties down from Gerald's Market. Now, Pernis Flowers originally was not called Pernis Flowers. Instead, it was opened in 1945 as a floral shop and greenhouse by a couple named Vern and Sophie Desalthouse, and it was called Desalthouse. They used their last name as the business name. Now, it's around the 1960s, Vern is said to have retired from the business. And after a few years of the property being not operating, in 1975, two men named Anthony Guglielmi and Paul Perrone opened what was called La Casa Verde, which was, again, another plant shop, but that only operated for a year. So in 1976, a couple named Irene and Alfred Perna, who owned a wholesale retail nursery in Lawrence Township that they established in 1932. Sorry, they established the nursery in 1932, not Lawrence Township, of course. So in 1976, Irene and Alfred opened Perna's plant and flower shop. Now, Irene and Alfred no longer operate the establishment. Instead, it passed to their children, and it remains in the family hands to this day as a popular local establishment and a unique defining element of Penn's Neck's history. And again, this property and that of Jerob's Market are both part of the Princeton Manor general development area. Another establishment, another institution that opened in the 1940s, just like Perna's did, was a different institution called Hayden Chemical Company. Now, this was not in the Princeton Manor area. Instead, this was directly on Route 1, on the east side of Route 1, so Route 1 northbound, directly south of the Dinky Line or the Princeton Branch Railroad. So it's where the BlackRock office building is today in 2024. Now, this institution was a chemical factory, which opened in 1943, or it was a factory, a medical factory, which opened in 1943. It opened in 1943 specifically for the purpose of helping the World War II effort, because soldiers on the front line needed penicillin to help with bacterial infections. So two of the big things that Hayden Chemical produced was, of course, penicillin and another pharmaceutical called streptomycin, which is an antibiotic and pain reliever. And you can see the advertisement for the company here. If you can't read it that well, I'm just going to read it off. So it says, the armed forces need penicillin, the new life-saving drug. Here's your opportunity to help produce it. We have openings, meaning job openings, for male or female, no experience necessary, including chemical operators and laboratory assistants. Positions also available for bacteriologists. We also need boiler firemen, and essential workers need a release statement. It's interesting that we have the term essential workers because we also had the coronavirus pandemic a few years ago where that term got a kind of resurgence in use. It also says writer applied directly to Hayden Chemical Corporation in Princeton, New Jersey. Now, it says Princeton, New Jersey, but this really was West Windsor. It just says Princeton because it was using the Princeton postal area. It's Princeton kind of as a term was and still is used to define the general Princeton area, including the towns surrounding Princeton. Really, this was West Windsor. Now, Hayden Chemical Company functioned as a factory up until 1953, at least, when it was purchased by American Cyanamid, which was a larger biopharmaceutical and international chemical conglomerate. But eventually, Hayden Chemical was demolished by the mid-1980s, if not much earlier, to make way for office buildings. And again, it was located where the BlackRock office building exists today, just north of Alexander Road, east of Washington Road, and just south of the Dinky Line or the Princeton Branch Railroad. However, we're talking about Hayden Chemical Company, but really the much bigger research and development facility was the RCA facility, which people might otherwise known as the David Sarnoff Research Center, otherwise known as what is today known as the SRI International Property. So a little bit of context. In 1919, RCA, which stands for the Radio Corporation of America, was founded by a few men, including a man named David Sarnoff in New York. And during its first few decades, it was at the forefront of a rapidly expanding radio and television industry. In 1942, because they had grown pretty rapidly, in 1942, they decided to open a larger research and development facility off of Route 1 in Penn's Neck. It was located where the Anglican Olden Farms are, or were prior to that. The exact address is 201 Washington Road and is specifically located just south of the Millstone River and east of Route 1 and north of all the suburban houses in Penn's Neck. So 1942 is when this facility opens. And originally, it was, let me just go a few slides further. Yep. Originally, it specialized in military technology, which I'm going to mention in a few slides. In 1951, it was renamed the David Sarnoff Research Center after David Sarnoff. And Sarnoff himself was pretty high up in society. He had ties and friendships with Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England during or Britain during World War II. He was one of the most famous prime ministers. He was had ties with Albert Einstein. He knew Marconi, who invented the radio, and he actually knew several United States presidents as well. And you can see the advertisement here for RCA's new facilities in West Windsor or in Penn's Neck. And if you can't read what it says below, it says RCA Laboratories, your magic carpet to new wonders of radio and television. Now, here's the facility. If you go back to the previous picture, I'll leave it up to you to figure out where within the present day drone shot that I took a few years ago, the original portion of the building is. But this is the facility. It has obviously a large research complex. There's a main building with several different wings. There's other ancillary buildings, an incinerator area. There's a number of other structures that were set up over the decades for various research and development purposes. And you can also see in the very back, in the very top of the photo, mostly on the left half of the top portion, top edge of the photo, you can see the Millstone River. And that's not exactly there, but that's relatively close to where the sheep wash was. Now, again, this facility was set up in 1942 during World War II. And originally it specialized in military telecommunications technology, such as radar, sonar, depth charges, and more. And as a result of its operations during the war, it became a much more streamlined company than it had been before the war. So after the war, it was in a prime position to expand to consumer and industrial technology. Now, it did keep its military contracts, but of course it expanded into consumer and industrial technology. One of the most famous things that you might very well know is that there were significant research developments that this very facility in Penn's Neck contributed to that resulted in the introduction of color TV. And this is the 1940s. By 1955 specifically, it had become $1 billion corporation with a B. 3 years later, in 1958, RCA established its Astro Electronic Products Division, and among the main things it did was design satellites to be spent to space during the space race during the Cold War, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And although their main facility was actually in East Windsor, and you can go to the Hightstown East Windsor Historical Society to learn more about that, there were employees within the Penn's Neck facility, the one that you can see here off of Route 1. Employees of that facility as well also helped with the development of these satellites. The picture on the right, on the very top right, shows the Tyro satellite, which was one of the most famous satellites of the space race. Now, in 1967, the David Sarnoff Library opens to the public, and this library contained a lot of the writings of David Sarnoff, a lot of the research that the employees of the facility conducted, some of their innovations, And it was where the public could kind of learn about how they developed things over the years and inspire them to develop things in turn. 1986, the facility, the David R. Sarnoff Research Center, was acquired by GE or General Electric, and it was turned into the Sarnoff Corporation, spun off as the Sarnoff Corporation, I believe the year later. Now, over the years, the facility has dwindled to some extent. In 2009, the David Sarnoff the David Sarnoff Library was shut down. A lot of its collections were moved to the College of New Jersey, and some of them were moved elsewhere. And then 2 years later, the Sarnoff Corporation integrated into its parent company called SRI International, which is why to this day, the property, which still functions to some extent as a research and development facility, has a big sign out in front of it saying SRI International. SRI stands for Stanford Research Institute. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit. So we're talking about Sarnoff, which started in the 1940s, but now we're going to move to the next decade, the 1950s, in the 1960s as well. So again, Route 1 was a defining feature of Penn's Neck, starting when it was chartered in the early 1800s, when the intersection of Route 1 and Washington Road caused Penn's Neck to cluster around that crossroads as a crossroads community. However, that intersection, again, originally was a four-way, just plain four-way intersection. These were just farm lanes with no traffic lights or stop signs or anything. But eventually there were enough traffic accidents that in 1931, after a lot of public petitioning, especially by local residents, an actual traffic circle was built. And this was just a pure circle. There was no cut through like there exists today in 2024. However, in 1959, Route 1 was cut through the circle, which you can see in this slide. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit squashed, but 1959 is actually when the circle was cut through by Route 1, giving the configuration that I of course, jokingly say people of today. And of course, I can't think of a single person who actually likes that intersection. There's so much traffic. But this photograph is from the 1960s, and in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a lot of activity around and establishments around the traffic circle. Today, there's only a few institutions at the circle. There's a AT&T cell phone / internet telecommunications store. There's a gas station / service center. And of course, there's the Princeton Baptist Church, but that's it. But in the mid-century, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a lot more activity. There were at least 2 diners. There was a furniture store. There were 4 gas stations, one for each corner of the intersection or the traffic circle. And there was a lot more activity as well. And you can see a lot of it in this picture here. However, over the decades, the businesses died out to give the current configuration that there is today. And there is an abandoned service center at the northern intersection of the northern intersection of Washington Road and Route 1, or the northern corner of that circle, again, where Guyverson's Tavern was in the mid-1800s. But again, that gas station has been abandoned for many, many, many years. Now, again, here's that picture. In 1959, you can see the church in the distance in the center of this photograph. So I just want to revisit this picture to show again how Penn's Neck how Penn's Neck really suburbanized. So we see the extent of Varsity View and Princeton Manor, and now these dashed lines show the current extent of Varsity View and Princeton Manor. However, to the east of Varsity View and the south of Princeton Manor are not, obviously you see dozens and dozens of more suburban homes. Most of these were built in the 1950s, 60s, and especially in the 1970s and beyond. And you can see they've basically filled in the old farmland with houses. Below that and south of the Princeton Branch Railroad and below the Princeton Branch Railroad, or aka the Dinky Line, are these office buildings. And even further south of that is the Carnegie Center. So over the decades from the mid 1900s onward, from the 1960s, 50s, and 60s onward, but especially taking off in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, Penn's Neck really suburbanized and lost most of its farmland. And even around the Penn's Neck Cemetery, which you can see in the top left of this photograph, the very top left of this photograph, even that farmland is entirely gone at this point. This aerial shot is not completely recent. It's a year or two old, and that farmland very recently was developed over. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, here is another shot of Route 1. Now, this is looking from north of the Market Fair Mall, so it's not exactly in Penn's Neck. It's maybe about a mile or two south, but this is another demonstration of how Route 1 really became a commercial center, a commercial corridor over the decades. You can see Canal Point Boulevard, which is the curvy, windy road in the kind of western left center side of the photograph, going from the bottom more or less to the close to the top. You can see all the homes to the left of that. You can see Market Fair Mall on the bottom of the screen. You can see Route 1, which is the wide road running from the very bottom right to the center top of this photograph. You can see Carnegie Center, which is an office and hospitality complex sprawling over hundreds of acres. And this has been one of the main themes of Penn's Neck's and West Windsor Township's history over the past several decades, starting in the mid to late 1900s, is its transformation, a dramatic transformation from a community where it was nothing but farmland, or virtually nothing but farmland, and then it transformed over the past few decades into this commercial and suburban, sprawling township, bustling with activity, bustling with traffic, and completely transformed from what it used to be. And that, again, that's one of the main things of Penn's Neck as well, which is why I'm bringing it up during this lecture as well. Now, one thing I should mention is this photograph, this rendering, this is a complex that is currently being developed. Is called the Link. It is called the Link at W Squared. W Squared is, of course, a reference to West Windsor. Now, this is a development composed of a lot of different buildings. Some of them are townhomes. Some of them are larger senior adult housing. There's a commercial establishments at the bottom. Now, this is just a rendering. It's a mock-up of what is currently being built. It is a photorealistic rendering. This is directly next to the Princeton Junction train station. And I mention this because although it's technically, I would not argue that it's located within Penn's Neck itself, it is located close enough to Penn's Neck that the traffic implications of this are going to be felt by residents of Penn's Neck. I believe it's several hundred. I could be wrong, but I think it's about 850 roughly housing units that are going in here. So it might be 1,500, 2,000 residents who end up living in this community directly, and its main output is onto Route 1. Sorry, not Route 1. Its main output is onto Washington Road, so which again flows directly through Penn's Neck. So I mention this because although I wouldn't necessarily consider this located within Penn's Neck, it's close enough that the traffic implications, if nothing else, are probably going to be felt pretty severely by the Penn's Neck community. Another thing that I want to point out is here's another, again, this drone shot was taken a few years ago by myself showing the Skank-Covenhoven Cemetery in the center. In the distance, you can see Carnegie Lake, and then past Carnegie Lake, even more in the distance, is Princeton. And I show this as an example of the farmland that used to exist up to just a few years ago. However, Princeton University is currently building a campus within this property over a few hundred acres. Now, Princeton University has owned this property since the portions of this property since the 1940s, and there are other portions of the property they've even owned since the 1920s. So they've had this property for generations. But they're starting to build a campus here, which originally they were going to call the Lake Campus, but they changed the name to West Windsor Meadows. And it's composed of a number of different components, including graduate research, graduate student housing, research centers, some recreational facilities. And as I mentioned prior, the Skank-Covenhoven Cemetery is not owned by Princeton University whatsoever. However, the land around it is, which is where they're developing the campus. And the cemetery, the Historical Society, we've talked with Princeton University about this, and Princeton Baptist Church, of course, because they're the caretakers of the cemetery. And the intent of the Princeton University is that the cemetery will become a kind of focal point for the West Windsor Meadows campus, and get a lot more eyes on it. So their idea is that it becomes kind of a feature of their campus. They don't intend, of course, to tear it down, according to them. But of course, there will be more foot traffic around the cemetery. Now, what the implications of that means for this cemetery has yet to be seen, but we, of course, hope and intend to make sure that it happens, that the cemetery remains intact and a distinct and unique and very important historical element of West Windsor's cultural and historic fabric. So one other thing I'll show is the Princeton Baptist Church. Again, this is the backside of the Princeton Baptist Church. The reason I have this in this slideshow is because for the purpose of the in-person lecture, which I had a few days ago, I just wanted to show the backside of the church and show you see this jut out portion, the shorter portion of the church. That was the vestibule, the area of the sanctuary that I believe was added to the church in the 1870s. And that's where the tour would have began for the in-person tour. And it actually is where it did begin. It was just a few minutes of touring the church property a few days ago. So I want to go to the last slide here and just thank you for watching this video. And for those who came to the lecture in person, of course, thank you for coming to the lecture. I want to again emphasize that we really do need donations. We really do need volunteers. And when I say volunteers, I don't mean just people who sign up to be a volunteer and then maybe come to one event and that's it. We mean regular, committed volunteers who can come regularly to help out in a variety of ways and join the board meetings, of course, and be part of the conversation and the planning and the future of the Historical Society in the long term. So if you enjoyed this video, please do donate. We need, of course, funds to continue our operations and to hold lectures like this one, including as well, because we can't make these lectures without doing research, and we can't do research without paying for certain subscriptions like Ancestry and Genealogy Bank, and without paying for our archives to be maintained. So if you'd like to help and support us, then please reach out to us. Our email is westwindsorhistory@gmail.com. Our phone number is 609-751-4061. Again, 609-751-4061. And you can also reach us at westwindsorhistory.com. On that website, you'll see links to either volunteer for us or contact us or donate us. Specifically, the link for donation is westwindsorhistory.com/donate, and the link for volunteering is westwindsorhistory.com/volunteer. Otherwise, again, I want to say thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot about Penn's Neck history. I hope that it inspires you to help preserve it and promote and spread the word of West Windsor history, and look forward to more videos in the future. Thank you once again.